for chapter 2.4. So you're going to click on that and make your copy of the notes. You guys can see it come up. Okay, we're going to go through our fill-in-the-blank notes today. So you should have your copy of your chapter 2.4 notes. They'll look like this. So, we went over our guided reading notes yesterday, and they kind of gave us a brief overview of what organelles are, and we looked at the function of a few organelles. These notes are going through each organelle and component inside a cell, and more specifically, like what they do and how they work together, and then how that all helps the cell to function. So, going over what an organelle is again, these are tiny cell structures that carry out specific functions within the cell. Okay, so we already know a cell is very, very small. Organelles are even smaller inside cells that have specific tasks and jobs to carry out to help the cell function and complete its job. So just like our stomach, lungs, and heart all have different functions in our body to keep us moving and living, organelles have different functions within the cell. Okay? They're like little organs in the cell. Okay, so we have our animal and our plant cell that we're going to look at. They share a lot of similar organelles, and then they have a couple of features that are different as well, or have different organelles than each other. So our cell wall is the rigid layer of non-living material that surrounds the cells of plants. And some other organisms do have cell walls, but no animal cells have cell walls. And the plant cell wall helps to protect and support the cell. So it acts like a barrier to kind of monitor and determine what material can pass in and out of the cell. And that also gives the plant cell its structure. So like when we looked through our microscopes and did our online activities, when we looked at plant cells, they looked boxy and had like a specific structure. And then even though the cell wall is very tough, it does allow materials to pass in and out of it. And the cell kind of dictates and determines what is okay to go in and out. And the cell wall is made of cellulose. So this is something different in plant cells in contrast to animal cells. Okay, so our outer edge layer of the plant cell is our cell wall. The next organelle or structure for cells is the cell membrane. So all cells have a cell membrane. It's located just inside the cell wall for plant cells, so it's kind of like a double barrier for plant cells. And then in other cells and in animal cells, the cell membrane acts as the first barrier or that outer layer that separates the cells from its environment. So the cell membrane also determines what can go in and out of the cell, what materials are safe to come into the cell. It might send materials out of the cell, and it can also block harmful materials if it feels like the cell could get attacked or something could happen to it. It can shut that off to make sure nothing can get in or out. Okay, so the cell membrane controls what comes in and out. Everything that the cell needs, from food to oxygen, has to enter the cell through the cell membrane. So just like when we eat food, the only way we can get the food in our body is through our mouth. So that is similar to a cell membrane. We can determine what we put in our body. Harmful waste products can also leave the cell through the cell membrane, and then through the organelles like lysosomes, which break down old parts of the cells and break down food. They can also go in and out of the cell membrane as well to kind of get rid of those materials. And again, the cell membrane can prevent harmful materials from entering the cell. So it acts as that protection and that barrier. So again, it's that outer layer for animal cells. Then the cytoplasm. This is between the cell membrane and the nucleus. It's a thick gel-like fluid, but it also is moving. So it's not thick enough like Jell-O where stuff is stuck in it, but it's thicker than water. So the organelles are found in the cytoplasm and then kind of move and float around within the cell within that cytoplasm. It kind of is like aloe, like that gel, yeah. Things can still kind of sink and rise and move around in it, but it also holds them into place a little bit. Okay, so that fills everything within the cell membrane, and your organelles are throughout. Then the nucleus, getting into organelles now. The nucleus is sometimes considered the brain of the cell because it holds the DNA and the directions for the cell to carry out its specific functions. Okay, it's also considered the cell's control center because that's where the directions for what the cell needs to do comes from. And then the nucleus has three distinct parts. There's the nuclear envelope, the chromatin, and then the nucleolus. So while the nucleus is one organelle in and of itself, it also has main components that each serve a purpose for the nucleus. the nuclear envelope is a membrane that surrounds the nucleus. You can think of this as a similar function of the cell membrane, but it's specifically for the nucleus. So it protects the nucleus from things that go in and out of it, and materials can pass in and out of the nucleus through like pores and small openings in the nuclear envelope. Just like materials can pass in and out of the cell through the cell membrane, this is what that acts as. Okay, the chromatin and the nucleolus then are components of the nucleus. So thin strands called chromatin are what contain the genetic material, which is the instructions for directing the cell's functions. So this is where your DNA is found. And then different parts of the cell read that DNA and figure out what it's supposed to do and how it's supposed to work. So for a leaf, for example, this chromatin tells the cell that it needs to grow, or it tells the cells that it needs to divide and separate and create more cells. It gives it that specific set of instructions. Okay, and then within the nucleus is another like dense little area called the nucleolus. And this is where ribosomes are produced or made. So ribosomes are another organelle that we will talk about in a little bit. But they produce proteins, which the cell then uses to carry out functions as well. And then they get sent like throughout the cell. Okay, so our little dense ball of Alright, then our mitochondria. This is probably one that most people remember or hear about. But they are considered rod-shaped structures. And mitochondria are known as the powerhouses of the cell because this is where the cells convert their energy from food into energy that the cell can then use to carry out functions. So just like when we take in food and we eat it and our body breaks it down into energy and fat and things that we can use to function and do things, the mitochondria does that for the individual cell. And then the type of energy that it makes is ATP energy. And we'll get into that, I think, in the next chapter as well, just kind of looking through what process is actually completed. Alright, so then around the nucleus, you will find the organelle endoplasmic reticulum. So this is a passageway that carries proteins. So those proteins are in the ribosome. So it carries ribosomes and other materials from one part of the cell to another. So the best way to think of what endoplasmic reticulum does is to think about hallways in a building. Okay, so if you thought of yourself as like a little ribosome or a piece of protein, and you were going to lunch out in the hallway, everybody's moving around with you, and you're going from one place to the other through that passageway. So that's what the endoplasmic reticulum serves as. It's just kind of that passageway to get that protein or ribosome from one place to another. And there are different types of endoplasmic reticulum. So the first type is rough ER, or rough endoplasmic reticulum. And this is just the ER that has ribosomes on it. So it's the ER that is actually carrying something and moving it from one place to another. So again, that would be like if you left class and were going to lunch, you were the little ribosomes moving from one place to another. Then, the second type of ER is smooth ER, and this just doesn't have ribosomes. So that would be like if you were stationary in a class or a specific location and you weren't moving, those hallways are empty, so it's smooth. Now, smooth ER does still have a function for the cell. It produces lipids, steroids, and carbohydrates, which are all still needed for the cell to use and function and have energy and store things. So yeah, it does still have a function and it's still around the nucleus. Rough ER and our smooth ER. Alright, then our ribosomes. Like we just went through, ribosomes are attached to some surfaces of endoplasmic reticulum, and they are just small little green-like organelles. Ribosomes also can like free float in the cytoplasm, so they don't necessarily have to be attached to something. They can just be floating around. But ribosomes function to produce proteins that the cell needs. So these proteins are sometimes used in the cell, or they are released through the endoplasmic reticulum, and then just kind of float around as well until the cell needs to use it, or until that protein gets picked up and transported somewhere else. And as we get further into our chapters, we will talk about protein synthesis, which is like how it's constructed and how it moves about the cell later on when we get into DNA. Okay, so ribosomes are all our little like dots floating around, or you can see them on the rough ER as well. Okay, so our next one is Golgi bodies, and this is going to be close to the endoplasmic reticulum, but as you would leave that passageway, you're going to see these like flattened tubes and sometimes little like sac areas as well. But this is what you could think of as the cell's like mail room. It's where it packages things and sends them out to other locations. So the Golgi body receives proteins, either like free-floating or from the endoplasmic reticulum. It can also receive other material from the ER, and then what it does is it packages it, and it sends it out to other parts of the cell that need to use it. The other thing it can do is release that material and those packages outside of the cell. So depending on what its directions were, it will either just distribute it throughout the cell to be used, or it'll send it out through the cell membrane for other cells to use, or for the organism to use in another way. Okay, then the next type of organelle, this is specific to plant cells, are green organelles called chloroplasts. Now they actually are green when you look at them in the cells. And what chloroplasts do is they capture energy from sunlight and use it to produce food for the cell. Through the process of photosynthesis, this is where that occurs. Chloroplasts also make leaves green, and then that is what we see. And the specific pigment that's in chloroplasts is called chlorophyll. Okay, so they float around in plant cells. Animal cells do not have these. All right, our next organelle is a vacuole, which is essentially just a big storage area of cells. So most plant cells just have one large vacuole, which they call like the central vacuole and things like that. And then there are some plant cells that don't have any vacuoles, but most do, or animal cells that don't have vacuoles, but others do. And essentially, they just store food, or they store other materials needed by the cell until it needs to use it at a later time, or if it has excess. It also stores waste products until they're removed from the cell. So it's just like that junk drawer in your house, or just a closet where you kind of shove everything into until you need it for a later time, or you eventually get rid of it. So again, animal cells usually have many small vacuoles kind of all throughout the cell, whereas plant cells have one large storage vacuole. Then our last main organelle that we're going to talk about are lysosomes. So these are small round structures, and they contain specific chemicals that help break down certain materials in the cell. So this could be large food particles in the cell that it needs to break down into smaller pieces for the cell to be able to use. They can also break down old cell parts, and then release that substance like through the cell membrane and get it out of the cell. Or it can kind of like recycle that material. So the best way to think of a lysosome is to think of it as like the cleanup crew. It's keeping everything like clean and tidy and organized, and making sure the cell can function properly. Okay, so again, they are small, just little structures floating around, cleaning up things that they need to. Okay, so those other features are centrioles, which you're going to find in animal cells, and these are near the nuclear envelope. So what they do is they help organize the structures and those microtubules that help construct the cell's skeletal system, which is actually the cytoplasm. The centrioles are kind of like braces or pillars that also help determine the locations of the nucleus and other organelles and kind of hold them in place in that cytoplasm. So they're not just moving around everywhere, they're kind of at a specific location. And then that cytoskeleton is all throughout the cell, and it gives that shape and that internal organization where things are kind of held in place so they're not super free floating, or it keeps the shape of the cell as it moves about. Or when the cell divides and creates new cells, your cytoskeleton plays a role in that and how it divides and kind of separates everything out. Okay, so centrioles just look like these little tubes and rods, and then your cytoskeleton is kind of this woven knit structure throughout this cell. Then, a couple other things. These don't have to go along with the organelles, but there are features on cells that help them move. So one of those features is called cilia, and this is on protists, and they can be on animal cells as well. But they're little hair-like projections on the cell that helps them move around, and it kind of like helps them crawl and move along in a wave. We do actually have cilia in like our body and in our cells, in the lungs, in our respiratory tract, so like what we breathe, and then even in our like middle ear, and I think even in like our like nose and sinuses, there's cilia as well. But what this does is, besides helping the cells move, it helps like trap particles, and then they get stuck. So like mucus and dirt, that way we can breathe. So like when you have a cold and you get all stuffy, it's because everything's just like getting clogged and trapped in there. Or if you like cough, things like that. Then another type of structure that helps cells move is called flagella. Now this is on bacteria, and there's some protists that have it, but mainly bacteria. And it essentially is just like a long like tail, where it kind of just swims around. And then it kind of is like a propeller. Okay, so cilia has hair-like structures all around it. Flagella just kind of has a little tail. Now, within our body then, we have specialized cells. Okay, so based on all of those organelles that create our cell structure, and the components of the cells, Cells are still different, and they're specialized, or they have a certain set of instructions to follow to complete certain tasks. So our example, nerve cells are specialized to transmit information from one part of your body to another, whereas red blood cells carry oxygen throughout your body. The cells still have the same organelles and are made up of the same components, but they each have a different set of directions to follow and a different set of like procedures to work through. Okay, so the way that cells are organized is you have your single cell, then it's organized into the group of tissues, then organs, then organ systems, and if you went a step further, those organ systems would create an organism, which is you. So a tissue is a group of similar cells that work together to perform a specific function. And then an organ, so like your brain or your stomach, your heart, is made of different kinds of tissues that then function together. So some of those tissues are like smooth to help like the acids in your stomach, like not decompose, but like break down your food. Your muscle tissue is like rigid or ribbed. Your heart tissue can be smooth and more elastic to kind of help pump the blood, things like that. And then an organ system is a group of organs that work together to perform a major function in your body. So that would be like your digestive system, which has your stomach, your small intestine, large intestine, like your esophagus. That all works together to like intake food when you eat it, and then you digest the food, and then it goes through, it takes the energy and the materials and chemicals from the food, and then you pass the food as for like the materials that you can't break down and digest as waste. But that performs that major function for your body. Okay, so again, we have our single cell. Then those cells make up tissues. Those tissues then work together to create an organ. That organ is part of an organ system that then creates the organism to function. Okay? For my hybrid kids, you are going to submit your notes when you're finished, and then we are good to go.